Good morning. It is now my privilege to introduce to you Dr. Joyce Zonana. She is a widely acclaimed author of several books and much literary criticism, as well as a professor of English literature. Through her literary talent, she has asserted a bold voice which exemplifies and extends the highest ideals of the feminist movement. Throughout her career, Dr. Zonana has remained committed to the furtherance of education and the feminist movement. She is currently an associate professor of English and Women's Studies at the Borough of Community College, CUNY. She began her teaching career at the University of Oklahoma and subsequently spent 16 years as the director of Women's Studies at the University of New Orleans, a little closer to home for us. The origins of this great woman are quite complex. She was born in Cairo, Egypt, into the Jewish heritage, and then at a very young age, she and her family were driven to the United States by a wave of anti-Semitic violence. As a result of this history, Dr. Zonana represents a plethora of cultures and perspectives. Her identity cannot truly be defined, and that is one of the characteristics that makes her writing so rich. Her own education began at Brooklyn College of the City University of New York, where she earned a BA in English literature. And from there on, she went to attain both a master's and a PhD from the University of Pennsylvania. Dr. Zonana remains active and influential through her writing, public lectures, and involvement in educational programs, such as the Freshman Writing Program at the Borough of Manhattan Community College, CUNY. She has been lauded for many of her literary works, which span from critical essays to books. She has also been formally recognized through several awards, including the Florence Howe Award for Feminist Criticism. Dr. Zonana's most recent achievement is a personal memoir entitled Dream Homes, From Cairo to Katrina, An Exiles Journey. This book traces her experience from growing up as an Egyptian immigrant in the United States to enduring the trauma that Hurricane Katrina brought to so many of our lives. Her writing is rich in description and emotion, stirring all of the senses. It beautifully portrays the inner conflicts that many of us encounter, the struggle between the past and the future, between tradition and conflicting dreams, and between the traumas of yesterday and the hope found in the new person that has emerged from them. She is an inspiration as an accomplished woman, a survivor of Katrina, and as one who openly confronts the complexity of finding individual identity. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Joyce Zonana.
Thank you so much, Catherine. It's such an honor to be here. I'm so grateful for your introduction and grateful to the people who brought me here. First, I want to thank T.R. Johnson, who suggested my name to Dr. Molly Travis, who took him up on it and invited me, and Jan Mulvihill, who I don't know if she's here, but who did lots of the behind-the-scenes work for organizing the conference, and it's really an extraordinary privilege and honor to be here. And of course, quite daunting, as I said to Molly before coming here, to be following such a distinguished speaker and woman of the world, woman who makes so much change in the world as Donna Brazil, and to also be here with all the other speakers. So I'll see if I can do my part, and because I've been a teacher and a writer, a teacher of literature, I'm going to take the focus inward a little bit. As I was thinking about the title of this conference, Power Lines, Women Transform the Grid, I kept sort of circling around the words power, line, and grid, and trying to find a way for me to get into those words and into the spaces that those words suggested. And as I did so, I kept feeling confined, right? The grid and the line were alien words to me, and they would stop me even before I began, right? I know, obviously, that the point of this conference is for us to think of ways to not be stopped by those lines, to think of ways to transform the grid. And so my experience, I think, parallels the experience that many of us have as women. And what I decided to do is to think about an alternate image. Instead of the grid, to think about the labyrinth, to think about that kind of space, a different kind of drawing. And I'd like to just show an image right now of what I have in mind when I'm talking about the labyrinth. Let's see if it will come up. There we go. So there's the labyrinth. That's the kind of space I'm going to be talking about today. In thinking about the labyrinth and the box or the grid, I'm reminded of my own experience when I moved a few years ago from New Orleans to New York. When I first got to New York, and still today living in New York, I felt very much boxed in by the lines of the city, by the grid of the city, vertically, horizontally, underground, overground. What you see are straight lines. And I had just come from 15 years in New Orleans where everything is sinewy and curving. It's a swamp city. It's a crescent city. It is, in my mind, in my imagination, a very feminine city. New York, to me, is a very masculine city. And even though I had grown up in New York, after my 15 years of living in New Orleans, I was absolutely transformed. And so I saw New York in an entirely different way. When I first had come to Louisiana, I had actually, I have to confess, been horrified by the city, horrified by the broken sidewalks, by the potholes, by the vegetation that was growing everywhere. It was a really scary place to me in many ways. It was also very disorienting, right? North, south, east, west are completely meaningless. Here, you have to use the river to orient yourself, upriver, downriver, lakeside, riverside. It took me a while to make that shift, but once I had made it, it has had a permanent effect on my consciousness. So I'm really happy to be able to be back here and to be here at Newcomb, a space, a feminine space, a female space that's been devoted since the late 19th century to finding pathways to power for women. So let me talk about the labyrinth just a minute. Most of you probably know a lot about labyrinths, but I'll just go over a little bit. The Oxford English Dictionary defines a labyrinth as a structure consisting of a number of intercommunicating passages arranged in bewildering complexity through which it is difficult or impossible to find one's way. Goes on to call it a tortuous, entangled, or inextricable condition of things, events, or ideas. So a grid is a place where you can find yourself. There are intersecting lines. You can say, I'll meet you at the corner of 34th and 5th, and it's very easy and very clear. In a labyrinth, it's very hard to say where you are. You are somewhere, but you can't map it in the same way as you could map your location on a grid. The word labyrinth comes from ancient Greece. It was used to refer originally to a structure on Crete, that it was a maze reputedly built by Daedalus to house the Minotaur, who was said to devour Athenian youths and maidens. So this would suggest that the labyrinth is a very dangerous place, that you don't want to go into the labyrinth by yourself. But evidence also suggests that the Cretan labyrinth was the home of the great goddess, that it was a place for initiation into a different kind of power, that it wasn't at all a place of death. There was an inscription in Knossos that is translated by Karl Karenyi, "To all the gods, honey, to the mistress of the labyrinth, honey." So this is image of the mistress of the labyrinth. Karenyi also says that the idea that the labyrinth is a place where we get lost is not a correct idea. It's a confusing path. It's hard, it may be hard to follow without a thread, but in fact there is a clear way in and a clear way out that leads you back exactly to where you began. So he distinguishes a labyrinth from a maze. A maze, you have lots of choices, but in a labyrinth you're actually led. Again, you don't know where you are, but you are being led along the path. So he calls it a passage to the light, and says there's a decisive turning at the center where you have to rotate on your own axis in order to continue. So I'm just kind of using this image to think about some things, and I have a few other pictures of labyrinths that I thought I would share with you. This is an ancient image with the Minotaur at the center. This is a labyrinth in England, an earth labyrinth. This is one of the oldest representations of a labyrinth from Crete on a clay tablet. Here's another common shape for a labyrinth. And this is a Native American image of a labyrinth. Here's another one. And this is the labyrinth in Chartres Cathedral, which is probably one of the most famous ones. So these labyrinth shapes have come down to us from antiquity, and today there's a worldwide movement to use labyrinths as tools for meditation. So labyrinths are constructed or found, and people walk on the labyrinthine path. In Audubon Park, this labyrinth was dedicated in 2006 as a space. It's imitating the Chartres labyrinth, and it's a space for meditation. There's one in Grace Episcopal Church, one at Trinity Episcopal Church, one at Lazarus House, and just recently, this one was built by an artist, Christopher Scott Brumfield, in the lower Ninth Ward, right beside the levee at the Industrial Canal. I don't know if it's still there. It was an installation that opened in December, but it's not there anymore. I don't know, but it's just very recent. So in my own experience, I've encountered some of these labyrinths and I've walked them, and it hasn't really brought me to any great revelations. But what has deeply affected me in my life are the labyrinths that I found myself in just in the course of living my life. And that's what I actually want to talk about. And I want to talk about a specific experience on a specific day that I had in 1999 when I went back to Cairo for the first time. As Catherine told you, I was born in Cairo. My family left in 1951. I was less than 2 years old. And all my life, I wanted to go back. And various things kept me from going back until in 1999, a friend and I decided to go together. And after I talk about what happened on this day, I'll talk a little bit about how we made this decision, how we came to be friends, and how it came to happen. So on this afternoon in January 1999, I set out in search of an old synagogue. The synagogue was called the Rambam. It was a synagogue that was associated with Maimonides, the 12th century philosopher and physician. And I had, before going to Cairo, I had gotten information from friends, and someone gave me a little Xeroxed sheet, which was called A Guide to Jewish Cairo. And it had names of various synagogues. And then it had this synagogue, and it said, it's not on any tourist itinerary, but it's an important place. And somehow I got it into my head that I wanted to go to this synagogue. And I had no idea, I didn't know anything about it, really. So I asked where it was, and a young American student who was working in Cairo said it's on the Darb Mahmoud, which is in the Muskie district. He couldn't tell me where the Darb Mahmoud was. He said it's an alley in the Muskie, and then he said, ask anybody and you'll find it. Okay, so I decided to try. This is a map of the Muskie district. I think you can see that it's not a grid-like map, and very complex, winding streets. So the Muskie is actually an ancient market area in Cairo, right next to the Khan Khalili, which is the touristy market. The Muskie is, in fact, a very, very traditional market, and there are very few Westerners there. It's just all these little winding streets. And my friend who I was with was an Egyptian, but even she was a little uncomfortable venturing into this space. So I'm going to quote from my book here. I'm going to read a little bit of the description of what we encountered on that day. Mervat, my friend's name, Mervat speaks for me, asking one shopkeeper after another if he can direct us to the Darb Mahmoud. The answer, go down that way, turn left, then ask again, is invariable. Each shopkeeper ponders her question, points, then turns away. There are customers to serve, neighbors with whom to chat. At each stopping point, Mervat asks again, selecting someone in a doorway or beside a sack of spices, someone who does not seem too disconcerted by our obviously Western clothes and uncovered cropped hair. For here in the Muskie, people are all in traditional garb. Men wear galabeyas and the women's hair is covered. We cannot hide the fact that we are strangers, intruders in this ancient district. What are we doing looking for an ancient synagogue on this hot Ramadan afternoon? As we continue to walk, apparently in circles, we begin to worry. At one bewildering junction, Mervat asks a man, "Left? Are you sure? Couldn't it be right?" And he looks at her with a weary smile. "Left, right, what's the difference?" he shrugs. "Suit yourself." "I don't think anyone knows where it is," Mervat confesses to me then. "They're just saying something to placate us. It's an Egyptian custom." "Okay," I say, "let's turn back. It's not that important anyway. Let's go back to the Khan Khalil." "No," Mervat says stubbornly, "we are not going back. We've come this far, and we're going to find it." Sweating in the heat, exhausted from her fast because it was Ramadan, Mervat refuses to abandon the quest. She is more committed than I am, determined to lead me to this abandoned old synagogue. It has become for her a matter of pride, a test of Egyptian hospitality. And so we continue, walking 50 feet, stopping, asking, walking 50 feet again. By now, I have completely lost whatever geographic orientation I might once have had. I cannot say where is north, south, east, or west. The sun is not visible in the hazy sky, and the district's ancient buildings and labyrinthine streets have become my entire world, crowding out all perception of the 20th century. We are in the district that was once called Harat al-Yahud, the medieval Jewish quarter, and here and there I glimpse a familiar name, Cohen or Levy or Seton. faded yet still evident above a shop. All around me, amidst the busy merchants and shoppers, I see beggars dragging themselves on blackened limbs, barefoot children playing beside piles of dung, ragged animals roaming hungrily. I want to flee, yet at the same time I am enthralled. Looking into the eyes of beggars and children and shoppers and shopkeepers, I sense that I have somehow reached a place where all difference is reconciled, where privation coexists with prosperity, where youth and age, male and female, animal and human, all share a common life, transient, eternal. Time seems to stop here in this place where I cannot separate myself from all that I see, the old man and the young woman, the buyer and the seller, the dying, the just being born. And then, as if within a dream, I glimpse a bare white dome arcing above a yellow wall. There, I whisper to Mervat, touching her shoulder and turning her so that she might see there. And so I was standing and I just saw this little dome, and I was sure that that dome was, in fact, the dome of the synagogue. And I tried to get Mervat to see it, and she was not convinced. She wasn't buying it. We didn't see anything else to indicate that the building might have been a Jewish center. So we were standing there debating, and a man just appeared and said, "Are you looking for something?" And he was dressed in Western clothes, and I think he spoke English. I'm not sure. I don't remember. But Mervat spoke to him and explained what we were looking for, and he said, "Well, yes, this building is a synagogue, but it's not the Rambam. The Rambam is just around the corner." So he pointed us in that direction, and we went around the corner, and we found it. And here's a picture of it. A plain, low building extending along a vacant, garbage-strewn alley. And I don't have a picture of the doorway, but I can tell you where to find one. A Star of David and a tablet with the 10 Commandments are carved above the main entrance. Beside it, I see the name of Moses ibn Maimun engraved in Hebrew and Arabic. The door is locked, the roof fallen in, the walls decayed. It's the inside. On tiptoe, I peer through iron grates into the sanctuary, see broken steps and crumbling walls, a worn bima where the Sefer Torah once rested. So as I was peering in to this space, which was locked, I just started crying, right? And I just started crying and crying and crying, and I could not stop crying, and I didn't know why I was crying. And there were guards who were guarding the alley, and they were very alarmed when they saw me crying, and they asked Mervat why I was crying, and she said, well, she's Jewish, and her family left when she was a child, and she's returning after all these years, and it's very emotional. And they said, let her cry, we must do what is right by her. And everybody assumed that I was crying in sorrow, that I was crying for loss, that I was crying for what had happened to the community. But that really isn't what it felt like. It felt like something else, and I couldn't explain it or name it or anything. There was this sort of profound just sense of homecoming, this sense of being in a place that I was supposed to be. So then that night, I went back with Mervat. We broke the fast together, and then I went back to my hotel, and I dreamt. I was woken by a dream in which there was a dome over my head. There were thousands and thousands of little Jewish stars in this dome, and there was an ancient sort of rabbinical-looking man's face looking down at me from the center of this dome. And I was just like, what does this dream mean? Why am I having this dream? What's going on? What is this place that I went to? Because somehow I thought the dream was connected to the place. So I had some papers that I had gotten from the Egyptian Jewish, the Egyptian, what's it called? The Jewish community of Cairo. And I started looking through the papers. It was like 2 or 3 in the morning. And I found this little passage written by the former president of the community. And here's what she wrote. Whenever she goes to the Dar Mahmud, she said, she could feel Maimonides' warm presence. Some of you will understand what I mean. For like myself and several others who suffered from various illnesses, we dreamed of Ben Maimon, who advised us silently of the cure we should follow. So what I realized was that this synagogue, actually this yeshiva, it was the place where he taught, was in fact a healing center, and that people went there for cures. People would sleep there. There were little rooms, little pallets where people would sleep. And most particularly, it was a place where women would go when they wanted help with childbearing. It was really known as a place to go if you were infertile or if you had had miscarriages. It was a place for healing. And since learning what I learned that day, I've read more about it, I've talked with people, and I have found out that it was used in this way for centuries. It was used in this way until the 1960s. Christians, Muslims, and Jews went there. It was, very important place. So that was exciting. But the best part is that when I went home back to the States and spoke with my parents about my trip, and they had really not wanted me to go to Cairo, and I'll talk about that in a minute, why they were very hesitant and scared about my going. But anyway, I told them about this synagogue, and I said, have you heard of it? Did you know about it? Did you have any connection with it? And my mother told me a story about her best friend who, when she was a child, had had an injury, and she had been brought there for healing. And then my father, who had Parkinson's disease and had dementia, this was just a few months before his death, he sort of woke up and looked across the table at my mother and said, "You went there, Nellie. You went there." My mother said, "Wow, did I go there? I don't know. I don't remember." My father said, "No, I remember distinctly. You went there when you were trying to get pregnant." So the year before I was born, because she had had like 4 miscarriages before I was born. So without knowing what I was doing, right, or knowing what I was doing, I don't know how we talk about this thing, I had circled my way, I had gone into the center and actually found my own center, right? I had found the place where I entered, right, the world, I think. I really believe that. And so this journey, to me, is a very important kind of journey, and I think it's a journey we can all make in one way or another, symbolically, finding that center. And I think sometimes doing it takes stepping off the map, right? Stepping off the grid and entering into these kinds of spaces. I'll go back to this one. This one, no, maybe this one, I think is the best one. Anyway, so I want to talk just a little bit about how I actually ended up that day in Cairo, because I think that's another important part of the journey. And it involves my friendship with Mervat and why we became friends. So when I was growing up, as Catherine mentioned, I had a bit of a struggle with my identity. I was Jewish, I knew I was Jewish, but I was also Egyptian. And how did Egyptian and Jewish go together? When I was a little kid, people would say, "You're not really Jewish, you don't eat gefilte fish," right? I was not an Eastern European Jew. But on the other hand, when we went to the Arabic neighborhood where we would buy the food that we ate and where I felt completely and totally at home, I also didn't speak the language. I didn't speak Arabic. And my mother taught me, I have to say, a little bit, not a little bit, quite a bit of racism in terms of creating a distinction between us and them, les Arabes, she called them. When she was growing up, when my mother was growing up, she grew up in Egypt. Her parents were Egyptian and Syrian. Her father had called her in French, which was the language they used at home, un pou dans du lait, which means a louse in milk. So he was criticizing her for her dark skin. He was suggesting that her dark skin sort of pushed her in the direction of Arab and away from the direction of Jew or European. And when I was a child and I was visiting my grandparents who were then living in South America, we went to the beach for a week. And when I came back from the beach, I was tan, I was very dark. And my grandfather, the same man, told me to go and wash my legs, wash my knees. He said I was dirty. So I went and I washed myself. I didn't know what was going on. And I came back and he said, "No, your legs are still dirty. Go back and wash again." So I went and I washed again. I came back and he said, "No, you're still dirty." And then he started yelling at my mother for allowing me to look like une Arabe, right? To make me look like une Arabe. And this was obviously a horrific thing to encounter, right? And I was always deeply and profoundly disturbed by it. And that's part of why I wanted to go back to Egypt and part of why I wanted to connect with the culture that we were, in fact, from. And in fact, this drawing of lines, this creating of a separation between Jews and Arabs is a betrayal of a historical truth, right? And the historical truth is that for centuries, there wasn't really a distinction. There were Jewish Middle Eastern people or Eastern Mediterranean people. There were Muslim Eastern Mediterranean people. There were Christian Eastern Mediterranean people. And they lived together in community. One scholar who to me is very, very important, his name is Amiel Al-Khalai. He's written a book called After Jews and Arabs, Remaking Levantine Culture. It's a book I think everybody should read. But here's what he has to say about it. He says, "For the last 100 years, the conflict between Zionism and Palestinian nationalism has retroactively affected most historical, cultural, political, and social discourse on Jews and Arabs," right? So in other words, we take the conflicts of the present moment and map them onto the past, and they don't really belong there. Many scholars talk about this long period of Jewish-Arab symbiosis, right? And of the Jews not being others or alien people in the Eastern Mediterranean or the Levant, but as in fact native to that territory. Right? We're so used to the idea of thinking about Jewish peoples as migrants and not belonging, but in fact, they belonged in that region. But, of course, also, the rise of Zionism changed that. And the rise of Zionism asked many Jews to make choices to identify with Israel as a state rather than with Jewishness as a way of being in the world. So in the 19th century, also there was a organization called the Alliance Israélite Universelle. It was a French organization, and it established schools throughout the Middle East to teach Jewish children. So French became the language that was spoken by Jewish families, and they started to identify with Europe rather than with their native space. So my mother, actually growing up, knew more about Paris than she did about Cairo, right? When she was in her 40s or 50s, she went to Paris for the first time, and she knew her way around, absolutely. She knew how to go, she knew all the monuments in Paris. She knew everything. But she didn't fully know the geography or the history of Egypt. So, for some reason, I felt called to try and shift that in some way. And part of it is that also when I was growing up in the States, I experienced firsthand what Edward Said calls Orientalism, right? The way of thinking about the Middle East as this exotic, strange, other place that you're going to dominate, right? Whenever I would tell people I was from Egypt, people would be just like stunned and fascinated and intrigued. And it was not like saying you were from, I don't know, New Jersey, right? It was just like very different. And my experience of Orientalism and my experience also in feminist consciousness led me to do some research in what I ended up calling Feminist Orientalism, which is a phenomenon that we find in a lot of Western feminist writers, starting with Mary Wollstonecraft and going throughout the 19th century and even continuing into the 20th century. It's a habit, a cultural habit of explaining the oppression of women as something we see in the East, right? Something that happens over there. And Mary Wollstonecraft, in A Vindication of the Rights of Women, talks about these Eastern habits within Western culture. She uses all kinds of metaphors. And so it ends up becoming a way that her argument for feminism becomes a very palatable argument for people who want the West to be the West. We just have to rid the West of this Eastern habit, right? We want liberation for women. That's not a weird thing. It's in keeping with the West. We just have to get rid of this Eastern custom. The harem, right? The veil, the supposed belief that Muslims didn't believe that women had souls. All these kinds of things you find them in all kinds of Western feminist writing. And I think it still occurs in contemporary Western discourse. So anyway, in doing the research for the essay, I read lots of Middle Eastern women's writings. And one of the women scholars whose work I read was a woman named Mervat Hatim, who was a political scientist who had studied the early feminist movement in Egypt. And she studied the relationships between European women and Egyptian women in the early 1920s in the movement. So I read her work, loved her work, quoted her work, and published my article. And then a year or two later, Mervat was speaking at the University of New Orleans, where I was teaching. I went up to her after her talk, introduced myself. She said, "Oh, you're Joyce Zonana. I read your work. I love your work. I always wondered how a Western woman could write that way about Middle Eastern women." I said, "Well, actually, I'm Egyptian." And she said, "Oh, we must be cousins." And then I said, "Well, I'm Jewish." And I was really afraid to say I'm Jewish. And she said, "Well, then we must be sisters." And her saying that initiated our friendship. And that, well, I'll just say a few more things about that. She was actually born in Cairo in exactly the same year that I was, in 1949. She grew up in Cairo, went to the American College for Girls and the American University in Cairo. And in 1971, she moved to the States for graduate school and ended up staying here. She lived through the 50s and 60s when there was a great deal of official anti-Semitism in Cairo, when the Jewish community was dismantled, basically. My family had left in 1951, but there were still a lot of people in 1956, the Suez Crisis. Many people were just expelled. I know people who were just told, tomorrow you have to be gone. And by 1967, there were practically no Jews left. There is still a tiny, tiny community. But at any rate, she grew up in that atmosphere of official anti-Semitism, but she was not persuaded by it in the same way that I was not persuaded by my parents' anti-Arabism. And she had an interest, as I did, in reclaiming that past, in finding a way to connect with a community that had once been a very vibrant community. So our friendship is an effort to restore, repair, transform relationships that have been broken by, I would say, the imposition of a grid on a cultural space that was much more fluid at one time. Mervat remembers that when she was in school in the 1950s and 60s, there was only one Jewish girl in her school, and that she always wondered about that girl because they would have religious instruction time, and the Christians would go off with the Christians, and Muslims would go off with the Muslims, and she said she always wondered where this girl went. And she never became friends with her, and we were just talking the other day, and she said she wishes that she had become friends with her. I never had any Muslim friends when I was growing up. My parents had actually never even eaten in a Muslim household. Again, sort of stunning, to live in a culture and not be involved with it. So our work, right, our project has been to try to repair what has been broken. And that project comes out of our living as feminists, writing as feminists, being committed to an Egyptian identity that is extraordinarily complicated. So my research on feminist Orientalism, my friendship with Mervat, also made me realize that I really wanted to explore in more depth my own story, and that I wanted to tell my own story. As an academic, you often don't tell personal stories, right? You tell objective, outside stories. It's much, much easier and safer. But I decided that I really did have to go inward, do that personal journey. And in doing the writing, in being committed to the writing, I also became committed to traveling and going back to Cairo, facing the fear that I had about going there. And, you know, there was no Minotaur at the center of the labyrinth, right? There was just the rotating on my own axis and actually finding my own axis and then coming back out here and bringing me here to speak to you today, which is great. So just stop with that. Thank you.